Everyone at the shelter believed they understood how dogs chose their people. It was not a complicated belief. It had been tested, over years, across dozens of adoptions, confirmed again and again, until it felt less like an opinion, and more like a law. Dogs ran toward the gentlest hands. They pressed their noses into the laps of the most patient visitors. They curled against the ankles of the people who knelt down first, who spoke in the softest voices, who arrived with the most love already visible on their faces. The staff had watched it happen so many times that they stopped questioning it. They simply trusted the dogs. The dogs always knew. That was the rule. And then one afternoon in late autumn, a dog named Marsh broke it. The shelter sat on the edge of a mid-sized town in the interior of the country. Not a glamorous place, not the kind of facility that appeared in fundraising brochures. It was functional. It was honest. The walls were painted a dull institutional cream that had yellowed at the edges, and the fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, like something that had forgotten how to rest. The kennels ran in 2 long parallel rows, separated by a narrow concrete corridor that always smelled of disinfectant and dog and something harder to name. Something between grief and waiting. On busy days, the noise was overwhelming. Barking echoed off the hard walls and collided with itself until it became a single, sustained roar that volunteers learned to hear without flinching. On quiet days, the silence between the barks was worse. The staff who worked there had learned to carry a particular kind of weight. They were not sentimental people, at least not in the obvious ways. They had seen too much for easy sentiment. They had held animals through difficult moments and cleaned kennels at 6 in the morning and made decisions no one wanted to make. What they had instead of sentimentality was something more durable. A deep, practiced attentiveness. They noticed everything. The way a dog held its ears. The set of its shoulders when a stranger approached. The quality of its stillness. Margaret had worked at the shelter for 11 years. She was in her mid-40s. Slight, with short dark hair going silver at the temples and a habit of chewing the end of her pen when she was thinking. She had seen thousands of dogs come through the facility, and she had developed a near clinical precision in reading them. She knew within minutes of meeting an animal whether it was afraid or aggressive or simply exhausted. She could distinguish between the bark of a dog that wanted attention and the bark of a dog that was telling you something important. Her colleagues trusted her instincts the way sailors trust weather patterns, not blindly, but with a confidence built from long observation. She was the one who had intake Marsh 11 weeks earlier. He had arrived in a wire crate in the back of a county animal control van on a Tuesday morning in early September. The officer who brought him in said he had been found behind a strip mall, thin and calm in a way that worried people more than frantic animals did. Not aggressive, not visibly injured. Just very, very still. The officer said he had not barked once during the entire drive. Margaret signed the paperwork and carried the crate herself into the intake room. She opened the crate door and stepped back. Marsh did not rush out. He sat for a long moment and looked at the opening, then looked at Margaret, then looked at the opening again, as if he were calculating something. He was a medium-sized dog of indeterminate breed, most likely a mix involving something hound and something shepherd. Though the proportions were unusual, his coat was a dense brindle, dark brown threaded through with amber, and his eyes were the color of old honey. He was not a beautiful dog in any conventional sense, but there was something about him that was difficult to look away from. He had a quality of attention that felt almost unsettling. The sense, when he looked at you, that he was not merely seeing you but considering you. He stepped out of the crate and stood in the center of the room, and held very still. Margaret sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and waited. He watched her for 4 full minutes. Then he walked toward her, not quickly, not with the bouncing eagerness of a young dog looking for connection, but deliberately, one step at a time, until he was close enough to smell her hand. He did not lick it. He simply stood there and breathed, and then walked to the corner of the room and lay down with his chin on his paws. She had never seen a dog do that before. She was not sure what it meant, but she wrote it down. In the weeks that followed, Marsh became something of a quiet phenomenon in the shelter. The volunteers noticed that he was unlike the other dogs in a way that was difficult to articulate. He was not unfriendly. He was not aggressive. He did not bark excessively or pace his kennel, or throw himself against the gate when people walked past. He ate his food consistently. He tolerated handling without complaint. He was, by all measurable standards, a well-adjusted animal. But he did not connect. Visitors came and went, and Marsh watched them with those amber eyes, and allowed himself to be touched and evaluated and discussed, and none of it seemed to move him. The young couple who had been searching for a companion for their aging retriever spent 20 minutes with him, and left without making a decision. The retired schoolteacher who had driven 40 minutes specifically because a volunteer had described him as deeply thoughtful dog, knelt in front of him for a long time, and then stood up slowly and said, with a kind of sad precision, "He's not ready." The family with 2 children under 8, who had been approved and were eager and patient, brought toys and treats and enthusiasm, and Marsh accepted all of it politely and showed them nothing of himself. Margaret had begun to wonder, quietly, whether Marsh was the kind of dog who would simply never choose. She had known animals like that before. Dogs whose histories had closed something inside them, sealed it off as completely as a wound healed over scar. They could be cared for. They could be maintained, but the particular electricity of connection, the thing that sparked between a dog and a person in those first minutes together, the thing the staff called the moment. It seemed, for some animals, to be no longer possible. She had not given up on him, but she had begun to wonder. The adoption event was held on a Saturday in late October, when the leaves in the parking lot had turned to a wet brown paste, and the sky was the color of old pewter. The shelter opened its doors at 10 in the morning, and the visitors began to arrive almost immediately. 20, then 30, then closer to 50 people moving through the kennels in a slow, deliberate tide. The staff had set up a small area near the front of the facility where potential adopters could spend time with individual animals in a quieter space, away from the noise of the kennels. It was carpeted in a rectangle of green outdoor turf and furnished with a few low benches and a basket of donated toys. Margaret managed the room. She watched families come and go. She watched a young woman fall completely and immediately in love with a beagle mix named Copper, who climbed directly into the woman's lap and fell asleep within seconds, as if the question had already been settled before either of them arrived. She watched a teenage boy sit on the floor with a black shepherd named Oliver for 20 minutes, neither of them moving much, just existing in the same space, and she recognized the particular quality of that stillness and made a note to follow up with the boy's parents. She watched an older man weep quietly when he met an elderly hound who reminded him, he said, of a dog he had lost the previous spring. These were the moments she had stayed for across 11 years. Marsh was brought into the room mid-morning. He entered the way he always did, calmly, without drama, scanning the space with those slow amber eyes. There were 6 or 7 visitors in the room. At that moment, a young couple with a toddler, a middle-aged woman who had been sitting quietly on one of the benches for nearly an hour, waiting patiently through several animals without finding one that seemed right, and a few others in various stages of considering dogs they had already met. And then there was the man near the door. He was not there for an adoption. That was immediately apparent to anyone paying attention, and Margaret was always paying attention. He had come with someone else, a coworker, it turned out, a woman named Diane who volunteered at the shelter periodically, and had persuaded him to stop in on their way to lunch, because she had a soft spot for the Saturday events. His name was Daniel. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall and lean in the angular way of someone who moved through the world quickly and without much waste. He stood near the entrance with his arms loosely crossed, and his weight shifted back slightly, the posture of someone who had come as a courtesy and was maintaining it with reasonable grace. He was not looking at the dogs. He was looking at his phone. Margaret registered him the way she registered most things. Quickly, without judgment, filing the observation for later consideration. She saw Diane gesture toward a golden retriever in the adjacent room, saw Daniel nod without particular enthusiasm, saw him follow Diane with the willing absence of a man who has agreed to be somewhere and intends to honor that agreement to the exact degree required. He was not cold, exactly. He was simply not present in the way the room required. She turned her attention back to Marsh, who had been standing in the center of the green turf, doing what he always did, surveying, measuring, calculating in whatever wordless way he calculated. Then everything changed. It happened in the span of perhaps 4 seconds. though Margaret would later try to reconstruct it, and find herself unable to account for the speed of it. Marsh's head turned. Not gradually, not in the exploratory scanning motion he used when he was simply being curious. It turned with a sudden, specific precision, as if something had called his name from across the room. He looked at Daniel. And then he moved. He crossed the room in a straight line, not fast, but with an absolute absence of hesitation, ignoring the toddler who reached toward him, bypassing the patient woman on the bench who had been waiting for something just like this, sidestepping a bowl of water someone had left on the floor, and he walked directly to Daniel and stopped. He pressed his nose against the back of Daniel's hand. Daniel looked up from his phone. The two of them regarded each other. There was a brief moment, no more than a few seconds, where it seemed like Daniel might simply pat the dog politely and return to his phone. In the same way a person on a train might acknowledge a stranger who has accidentally sat beside them. He lowered his hand slightly. Marsh pressed into it harder. Something passed across Daniel's face that was difficult to name. He put his phone in his pocket. The room had gone subtly quiet, not silent. There were still voices, still the distant sound of the kennels, still the background noise of an active Saturday, but the quality of attention in the room had shifted. The volunteer near the door had stopped what she was doing. The middle-aged woman on the bench was watching with an expression of careful attention. Even the toddler, who had been conducting a small private investigation of a rope toy, had paused. Margaret moved to Marsh's side and knelt down. "He usually takes a while to warm up," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Is that right?" Daniel said. He was still looking at the dog. She gently reached for Marsh's collar to lead him toward another visitor, the young couple who had been politely waiting. She had protocols. She had a process. She was not going to make assumptions about what this meant, because she had been doing this long enough to know that even remarkable moments could be misread. Marsh did not move. She applied a gentle, steady pressure. He turned his head and looked at her with those amber eyes. And then he turned back to Daniel and pushed his nose once more against Daniel's palm. She released the collar. The young couple looked at each other. The woman smiled, not unkindly, and the man shrugged in a way that meant they understood. And they moved on to look at a terrier mix someone had brought in from the back room. Margaret sat on the bench and watched. Daniel crouched down. It was an awkward crouch. He was the kind of person whose body did not have much natural ease in that position, and he compensated by bracing one arm across his knee. Marsh stepped forward and put his head beneath Daniel's lowered arm, not in a demanding way, not the way a dog seeks attention, but in the way an animal settles, as if he had found the location he had been looking for, and was simply occupying it. "I'm not a dog person," Daniel said, to no one in particular. No one responded to that. Diane appeared in the doorway and saw the two of them, and stopped walking. She looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her. Diane opened her mouth, and then closed it again. The volunteer near the door, a young woman named Priya, who had only been at the shelter for a few months, leaned close to Margaret and said quietly, "Is that normal?" Margaret thought about the retired schoolteacher who had said he was not ready. She thought about the young couple and their patient enthusiasm. She thought about 11 weeks of Marsh watching visitors with amber eyes and showing them nothing of himself. "No," she said, "it isn't." The hours that followed were confusing for everyone in a way that no one had quite anticipated. The staff's standard procedure, when a dog showed a strong connection to a visitor, was to facilitate a longer meeting, a walk, a quiet session in a separate room, some time outside if weather permitted. Margaret arranged all of this. She led Marsh and Daniel to the small outdoor area behind the facility, a fenced rectangle of dry grass and gravel, with a few low benches along the perimeter. Marsh walked at Daniel's side without a leash. That was not typical. Marsh was always leashed in the outdoor area. He had never done anything unpredictable in those enclosures, but protocol required the leash, and Margaret had simply forgotten to attach it in the mildly surreal quality of the previous 20 minutes. She noticed when they were already outside, and she decided not to correct it, because Marsh was walking as though the leash were simply beside the point. Daniel sat on a bench. Marsh sat at his feet. Daniel looked at the sky. Marsh looked at Daniel. "You know I live in an apartment," Daniel said. Marsh did not offer an opinion on that. "A small one." A crow called somewhere overhead. The dry grass moved in a thin wind. "I travel for work," Daniel said. "Not constantly, but enough." Margaret sat on the other bench and watched without appearing to watch. She had seen this conversation before, or versions of it. The internal negotiation a person conducts when something unexpected has happened to their carefully maintained plans for the day. She had learned not to intervene in it. The negotiation was necessary. It needed to be allowed to proceed. Diane stood at the gate with her arms crossed and a small, wondering expression on her face. Later she would say that she had never seen Daniel look like that before. That particular quality of stillness, as if the thing that usually kept him slightly ahead of himself had simply stopped, and he was just sitting there, present in the full and ordinary sense. Then Marsh stood up. He moved to the bench and placed both his front paws on the surface beside Daniel's leg, not climbing up, not demanding, simply raising himself to the same level. He put his nose against Daniel's shoulder. He stood like that for a long moment, breathing. Daniel turned to look at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, the expression on his face was not the polite, calibrated expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation. It was something older and less managed than that. It was something that looked like recognition. Margaret would not have been able to say what she was watching, not precisely, but she had been doing this long enough to understand that what happened between an animal and a person in moments like this was not simply about breeds or compatibility scores, or the neat logistical questions of space and time and travel. It was about something that preceded all of that and did not ask permission. Later, after Daniel and Diane had left the outdoor enclosure and Daniel had gone to find coffee and something to eat, Margaret sat with the shelter's director, a soft-spoken man named Edward who had been running the facility for 16 years, and she tried to explain what she had seen. He just went directly to him, she said, like he'd been waiting. Edward stirred his coffee. Has the dog done anything like that before? Nothing. 11 weeks of nothing. Edward looked out the window at the empty outdoor enclosure. Did you look at the intake record? The original surrender record? Not in detail. Look at it, Edward said. She pulled the record that afternoon, during the quiet hour between the end of the morning event and the beginning of the afternoon feeding schedule. She sat at her desk and spread the papers out in front of her. Most of what was there was standard. Weight, approximate age, physical description, health assessment. The county officer's notes were brief. Found behind a strip mall. No identification. No microchip registered to a current owner. Thin but not malnourished. No visible signs of abuse. At the bottom of the page, there was a single additional note that the officer had added, apparently as an afterthought. She read it twice. It said, "Previous shelter transfer records indicate animal was surrendered approximately 14 months ago by a William Hartley. Address redacted. Surrender reason listed as owner relocation. Animal showed significant separation distress at intake. Notes from previous facility indicate animal bonded very strongly with one individual during previous ownership period and did not readily transfer that bond." She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Daniel. He was in the lobby, sitting in one of the plastic chairs near the front desk, holding a paper cup of coffee and looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He set down the cup. "Do you have any connection to this area? Someone who might have had a dog like this a few years ago?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him. "My brother," he said. She waited. "He moved overseas about 2 years ago. He had a dog for a while." He paused. "A dog he loved a lot. He couldn't take him when he left. He found someone to take him, or he thought he did. I don't know what happened after that." He looked at the paper cup on the floor beside his chair. He talked about that dog for a long time afterward. He said he'd never had anything like it with a dog. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. "His name was William," Daniel said. "My brother." Margaret said nothing for a moment. "We're not identical," Daniel added, "but people always said there was something. The way we stand. The way we move." He looked at his hands. "I never really saw it." She thought about Marsh in the intake room on that September morning, sitting in the open crate door, calculating. She thought about 11 weeks of amber eyes watching visitors and showing them nothing. She thought about the way he had crossed the room in 4 seconds, without hesitation, in a single straight line. She thought about the note at the bottom of the intake form, significant separation distress. Did not readily transfer that bond. "I think," she said carefully, "that he recognized something." The shelter did not normally allow same-day decisions. There was a cooling off protocol, a standard waiting period between a significant connection and a formal adoption, designed to protect both the animal and the human from decisions made in heightened emotional states. Margaret had written parts of that protocol herself. She decided that afternoon that she would need to use her judgment. She found Daniel still in the lobby 20 minutes later and sat down across from him and set the adoption paperwork on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. "I told you, the apartment, the travel, those are real considerations," she said. "I wasn't planning on this. Most people aren't." He picked up the pen and held it without writing anything. "Is he gonna be okay? I mean, is he?" He stopped. "He's been waiting for a long time." "Yes," she said. He looked at the door that led back into the facility, in the direction of where Marsh was. Priya, the young volunteer who had been watching all of this unfold across the day, had brought Marsh back to the lobby. She had not been asked to do this. She had done it because it seemed necessary, in the way that certain things during certain days seemed to simply require doing. Marsh walked into the lobby and found Daniel immediately. Not by sight, since the lobby was full of people coming and going, but by something else, something that cut directly through the noise and movement and arrived at its destination without detour. He sat down beside Daniel's chair. He did not put his head in Daniel's lap. He did not perform. He simply sat, very close, with his shoulder against Daniel's leg, and waited. Daniel looked at him for a long time. Then, he signed the paperwork. The drive home was quiet, from what Daniel later told people. Marsh sat in the back seat and watched the town give way to highways, and the highways give way to the neighborhood where Daniel's apartment building stood. He had stopped at a pet supply store on the way. Food, a bed, a collar, a leash. He bought things without much of a plan, walking the aisles with a dazed deliberateness, and Marsh walked beside him on his new leash with a patience that seemed, to the few other shoppers who noticed, almost preternaturally calm. The apartment was small. It was on the 4th floor of a building with an elevator that moved slowly. It had 2 windows that overlooked a parking lot, a kitchen that required a person to stand with their back against one wall to open the refrigerator, and a living room that was neither large nor small but precisely the dimensions of a space a single person had filled carefully with the particular objects of a particular life. Books stacked horizontally on shelves that were slightly too small for them. A desk against one wall with papers organized into a system that made sense to its owner and no one else. A couch the color of charcoal. A coffee table made from a single piece of pale wood. A print on the wall from a museum exhibition Daniel had attended in a city far away, the name of which he could no longer clearly recall. He stood in the doorway with Marsh on the leash and showed him all of this, and Marsh surveyed it the way he surveyed everything, with that slow, precise amber regard. Then Marsh walked to the center of the living room and lay down. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he unclipped the leash and set it on the hook by the door, and went to make himself a cup of tea. That was the first night. In the weeks that followed, Margaret received periodic updates from Daniel, because she asked for them, and because he turned out to be someone who answered questions when asked, which was a quality she valued without being entirely sure why. He sent short messages, mostly, with occasionally a photograph. Marsh sleeping under the desk while Daniel worked. Marsh on the leash in the parking lot below the apartment building, sitting patiently while Daniel exchanged a few words with a neighbor. Marsh in a dog park that Daniel had found 3 blocks away, standing at the fence and watching other dogs with a quality of attention that the dog park regulars apparently found. Daniel reported, slightly unnerving in a good way. He was not what Daniel had planned for, but he was, as Margaret had suspected from the beginning, exactly what Daniel had not known he needed. There was a quality in Daniel's messages that she had learned to recognize across years of following up with adopters. A kind of involuntary warmth, the tone of a person who is reporting facts, but cannot entirely prevent the feelings from showing through the reporting. He wrote about Marsh the way people write about things that have surprised them, not with sentimentality, but with the honest astonishment of someone who had been certain of one thing, and had discovered, without warning, that the certainty was provisional. He wrote, at one point, about calling his brother. I told him. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked me to send a photo. I sent him the one from the dog park, the one where Marsh is sitting by the fence looking intense. He called me back 20 minutes later. He said, "That's him. That's exactly him." I said I knew. Margaret kept that message. She was not entirely sure why. She thought about it sometimes during the quiet afternoons, when the shelter was between events, and the kennels were resting and the fluorescent lights hummed their low, indifferent hum. She thought about what it meant, the question of how Marsh had known, the precise mechanics of it, the science of it, such as it was, laid out in studies she had read over the years, the extraordinary sensitivity of a dog's olfactory system, capable of detecting not just individual identity but emotional state, hormonal signature, the particular chemical signature of grief or stress or familiarity, the evidence that dogs recognized relatives of people they had loved, through the biological similarities encoded in scent, the research on canine memory, which was longer and more complex than most people assumed. She understood all of that, but she also knew that the science did not fully account for what she had witnessed in that green, carpeted room. The 4 seconds, the straight line, the complete and certain absence of hesitation, the way Marsh had arrived at Daniel's side and simply settled there, as if all the weeks of waiting had been a single unbroken act of faith that was now, at last, completed. She thought about what she might have missed if she had managed to pull Marsh away in those first minutes, if she had been more insistent, more professional, more committed to the orderly management of the process. She had been trained to read animals, but she had also been trained to maintain protocols, and the two things sometimes required choosing one over the other. And on that Saturday in late October she had, almost without deciding to, chosen to trust the animal over the protocol. She thought she had made the right call. But she thought about it. Priya asked her about it a few weeks later, during a slow Tuesday afternoon, when they were both catching up on paperwork. She asked it the way young people at the shelter asked things, directly, without preamble, not quite aware that the question had weight. "How did he know?" Priya asked. Margaret put down her pen. "I think he smelled his brother," she said. "There are studies. Dogs can recognize familial scent markers. It's not simple, but it's real." Priya nodded. "But it was more than that, right? The way he just went straight there." Margaret thought about the retired schoolteacher. She thought about 11 weeks of amber eyes and nothing. She thought about the particular texture of waiting, and what it looked like in an animal, and how it differed from depression, from resignation, from the quiet tragedy of a dog that had given up. She had seen all of those things, and what Marsh had been doing was not any of them. He had been waiting. "I think," she said slowly, "that he knew what he was looking for, and he kept looking until he found something close enough." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Close enough," she repeated. "His brother was gone. That wasn't coming back. But Daniel was." She stopped. "There are things dogs understand about us that we don't understand about ourselves. About what we carry, how we carry it." She picked up her pen again. Hay could smell what Daniel came from, and it was enough. The room was quiet except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of the kennels. "We thought he was choosing wrong," Priya said. "We didn't have enough information," Margaret said. "We almost never do." There was a moment, about 3 months after the adoption, when Daniel brought Marsh back to the shelter. Not because anything was wrong. He came back because he had called Margaret to ask if it would be appropriate, and she had said yes. "Come by. We would love to see him." He arrived on a Wednesday morning, when the shelter was quiet. He walked Marsh through the front door and down the corridor past the kennels. And the dogs who were still waiting looked up as they passed, the way they always did, with that mixture of hope and appraisal that was the particular expression of an animal assessing whether a stranger might be the specific stranger it had been waiting for. Margaret met them in the lobby. Marsh walked directly to her and stood in front of her and looked at her, and then he walked back to Daniel and stood beside him, and that was the whole of the reunion. Brief, businesslike, without drama. Margaret looked at Daniel. He looked different than he had in October. She could not have said specifically how. The same face, the same angular frame, the same slight lean toward efficiency in the way he moved. But something in the quality of his being there was altered. He was more present, or differently present, or present in a way that occupied the space differently. "He's good," Daniel said. "I can see that," she said. Edward came out of his office to say hello, and they stood in the lobby for a few minutes and talked about nothing in particular. The shelter's upcoming fundraiser, the approaching winter, The new intake policies the county was considering. Marsh sat on the floor between Daniel's feet and watched the conversation without apparent interest. When they left, Margaret stood at the front window and watched Daniel's car pull out of the parking lot and onto the street. She watched until it was out of sight. Then she went back to her desk. She sat for a moment before doing anything. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone down the corridor was talking to a dog in a low, soothing voice. Outside, the winter sky pressed flat and gray against the windows. She thought about what she believed now, compared to what she had believed in September, and whether anything had fundamentally changed. The rule still held, she decided. Dogs chose the right person. That had not changed. What had changed was her understanding of what right meant. It did not mean what the room assumed it meant. It did not mean the person with the most obvious warmth, the gentlest hands, the most demonstrated enthusiasm. It did not mean the family with the children, or the retiree with the patience, or the young couple with the plan. Sometimes right meant something more oblique, more entangled with history and loss, and the invisible cargo a person carried in their scent and their posture, and the particular frequency of their presence. Sometimes right meant, this person carries something I recognize. This person carries a trace of something I loved. This person is not the thing I lost, but they are connected to it in a way that is real and deep and worth the risk of crossing the room. Marsh had not made a mistake. He had made a calculation that none of them had been equipped to understand, and he had made it with a precision and confidence that no amount of staff training or intake protocol could replicate. He had looked at a room full of people who were present and ready and willing, and he had identified the one person who carried, in his blood and his bone and the particular chemistry of his existence, a trace of the thing Marsh had loved most. And he had walked straight to him, without hesitation, without asking permission. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and the shelter hummed around her. The lights, the kennels, the low voices of volunteers moving through the corridor, the sound of animals waiting for the moment that was theirs, whenever it came, in whatever form it arrived. Outside, the winter light was thin and sharp and indifferent. Inside, the waiting continued, as it always did, as it always would.